David is an interesting figure. Skeptics through the years have often said that he was a fiction, that he really didn't exist, that the only place he was ever mentioned was in the Bible. But recently, archaeologists found evidence of David in a secular archaeological dig where a king was talking about doing battle with the house of David, totally outside of the biblical record. We're starting to see more and more through archaeology that David was a real person with a real history. In First Chronicles today, we're going to be looking at the lineage of David's family. We're going to be seeing a careful record of how David came about, who his relatives were, and why that starts to become important for us when we're looking at the line of Messiah. And we'll do all that when we come right back. Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends, where our goal is to help you get more impact from your Bible study. I'm here with my friend Kyle Grinstead. Kyle and I are going to continue our study in First Chronicles. I've got to tell you, Kyle, as I mentioned off camera, that I've been studying the Bible for 56 years. And in these verses, we're going to go from First Chronicles chapter 2, verse 1 down to about verse 17. And I've got to tell you that I learned something in this study for this week's time together that I have never seen before. That's amazing. You can read the Bible 100 times and see something new when it comes to God speaking to you from God's word. Let's get into this. I want to talk to you. This section is interesting, and it has from Jacob, whose name becomes Israel, through to King David. We're going to see the lineage of David and some interesting things about that lineage that perhaps we didn't know before. So we're going to go slow. We're going to look at some details, ask ourselves some questions, and hopefully learn a little bit about the line of Messiah through King David and what his family was like. You think your family is messed up. Wait till we hear about some of David's line. But anyway, let's get into that. I want to show you a note here I made that'll put this into perspective. We're going to go through 17 verses today, and I put here a little note in my Bible that we're going to go from Jacob to David. Now, Jacob was born approximately 1791 BC. Jesse, who is a descendant of Jacob in the direct line to David, he was born approximately 1140 BC. And he produced David. Remember, David is the root of Jesse. And he produces David when he was about 100 years old. David is born in 1040 BC, approximately. What we have then is a record from 1791 to 1040 BC, a record of 740 years, and we're going to cover it in 17 verses. So we're going to move right along. But this kind of reinforces what we've been talking about, that the purpose of First Chronicles is not a detailed history of the nation of Israel. And we're going to see that in the very first verse. If we look at verse 1, it talks about the sons of Israel. Now, we talked about that in previous week, that it's interesting here that he says the sons of Israel. In most other places in the scriptures, it talks about the sons of Jacob. Abraham produces Isaac. Isaac produces Jacob. And if you go up to chapter 1 of First Chronicles, verse 34, just flip up and read that real quick for us.
Abraham fathered Isaac. The sons of Isaac were Esau and Israel.
So it's interesting that the chronicler here is Ezra, but he is interested in establishing credentials for the Messianic line. When he refers to Jacob, he refers to Jacob in the covenant name of Israel, the name that God gave him after he wrestled with the angel, right?
Yeah.
So the chronicler here is interested in the Messianic line and really doesn't go into a whole lot of details of Jacob when he was the cheater. He wants to talk about Jacob as the man who wrestled with God and was blessed by God and made a great nation. He uses the name Israel. In most other places of the Old Testament, when it talks about him, it talks about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, emphasizing the repentant side of the sinner Jacob before he was the covenant Israel when God changed his name. So in this verse, it's just where it shows this interesting thing. These are the sons of Israel. And if we count them, how many do we have there? From Reuben
12.
to Asher.
12 of them.
There are 12. It's amazing. Now, it's interesting that in the 12, if you notice, the only one that has a next generation is Judah.
I did notice that.
So you go, well, why did he leave out Reuben and Benjamin? Because he's tracing the line of David. The Messianic line comes through Judah. That's
Right.
why Jesus is called the Lion of Judah. We see the chronicler in First Chronicles is only interested in the Messianic line. He doesn't worry about giving details about the other 11 brothers. He goes, got the 12 brothers, and then verse 3, the sons of Judah were and Onan. Now, I circled right here this little letter A and went up to verse 3, the little letter A, and it talks about Genesis 38, 2 through 10. Now, we're not going to turn there, but do you know the story of and Onan?
No.
They are the first two sons of Judah, and they turned really evil. The Bible says they became so evil that God literally kills them. The first son is married to a woman named Tamar. Tamar is widowed when dies. Traditionally, the next brother would take the wife, the widow of the first brother, to have children under the name of the first brother. That was a tradition so that the name of the first brother didn't die out completely. The second son, Onan, marries Tamar, and he is killed by God. Now, there's one other brother, and that is Shelah. Shelah is the youngest brother. And when the first two are killed by God, he is really young. So Judah says to Tamar, hey, just wait. And later, when Shelah is old enough, I'll let you marry him and you can have children from him.
Okay.
Now, that's all recorded in Genesis 38. So you can go back there and do this Bible study. But it becomes interesting and complicated. Well, let's look at this. I'll read verse 3. The sons of Judah were and Onan and Shelah. These three were born to him by Bathshua. Now, Bathshua basically means the daughter of Shua. In other places where she is mentioned in the scriptures, she's just called Shua. So Bathshua is a woman that's mentioned, and so I've got her circled. Remember, we started to have very few women, and then the more and more we get into David's line, the more important women become. So now we're tracing Bathshua, the Canaanitess. If you want to go back into chapter 1, verse 8 and verse 13, it talks about that Cana was one of the relatives, right? So basically, these are cousins, distant cousins. And Bathshua produces and Onan and Shelah. And Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, so he put him to death. Now, look at this. Read verse 4.
Tamar, his daughter-in-law, bore him Perez and Zerah. Judah had 5 sons in all.
Now, notice Tamar his daughter-in-law bore him. If you go back into the story, Tamar waited for her right as a husband, and Judah started to think this Tamar is a bad luck wife because I keep marrying her to my sons and they keep dying.
Yeah.
So I'm going to not give her to Shelah. He's my last son, and protecting him is important, so I'm not going to give him. And if you remember the story, Tamar dresses up like a prostitute and goes to the side of the road and gets Judah to get her pregnant.
I remember that.
Okay. Now, if we go into the book of Matthew, the first chapter of Matthew, we find out that Tamar is a very significant woman because she is listed in the direct line of Jesus.
Yeah.
So we have in the direct line of Jesus a Canaanite woman who pretends to be a prostitute in order to get pregnant from Judah.
Yeah.
Who's going to end up being David's great grandparent. So the family is getting interesting here, right? From Tamar, after he discovers, hey, I got my daughter-in-law pregnant, he marries her and he has more children with Tamar. Let's go back to that verse. Tamar, his daughter-in-law. Whose daughter-in-law? Back up here to Judah, right?
Judah.
So his daughter-in-law bore him, Judah, Perez, and Zerah, 5 sons in all. Now, only 2 are mentioned here. We're going to get more in a second, but Perez and Zerah. Perez is immediately followed up with the sons of Perez were Hezron and Hamul. I want us to pay attention to Hezron because even after we're done with these first few verses, a big chunk of First Chronicles chapter 2 is given to the children of Hezron.
Okay.
We just watched that. Now watch what happens. He has Hezron and Hamul. So now Hezron is a second generation from Perez. Perez is directly from Judah. We following that?
Yep.
Okay. So Perez has Hezron and Hamul. Zerah has a bunch of sons, 5 of them. Now then, if you're paying attention, verse 7 comes up with Carmi. Now, the son of Carmi was Acre. Now, where is Carmi mentioned in this earlier line?
Yeah, he's not mentioned. I checked for that too.
Yeah, you noticed that. Okay, good. Now, if we go with trying to find out who this guy is, the key is Achar.
Okay.
If we go to Joshua chapter 7, verse 18, we see an episode where Israel begins to be punished by God. And they go, why are you punishing us? And he says, because you broke the ban. When they started to go into the land, there was a ban that said, when you take these nations, you don't keep any of their stuff. It's all supposed to be destroyed, remember?
Yeah.
And what did Acre do? He saw some goodies and he kept it. Because of that, if you go to that story in the scriptures, you see that Acre was the cause of the whole nation of Israel being punished until he was found out and confessed and was punished for what he had done. If you notice back in this verse, Carmi, which he was the father of Achar, okay? He wasn't in the line of Messiah, but he was significant in the history of Israel because it was through Achar that he was the troubler of Israel. And if you go to Joshua chapter 7, verse 25, he's called that because of him, Israel was troubled by God. He violated the ban.
Yeah.
So that's why we have Carmi listed there. It's just to make a footnote in the history of Israel that Achar was part of this history that caused God to really come down hard on Israel in the past.
Okay.
All right. Now, we then go with another son. So Hezron, we see, and the sons of Zerah was Ethan. And then we have Ethan down here. So it jumps down. Ethan, the son of Ethan was Azariah. Now the sons of Hezron. So now we're bouncing back up to Hezron. That's why I did these lines just to help us. Hezron, were born to him were Jeram, Ram, and Chelube. Now, Chelube and Jahramhael. This is why I'm not making you read these, brother.
Thank you.
If you notice here, Hezron produces Ram. And immediately, it doesn't talk about the rest of these guys. Immediately, it goes into the children of Ram. Now, that's because Ram is directly in the line of David. So again, this just shows the chronicler is interested in the line of David, not in the details of the rest of these guys.
And it almost looks like starting with Ram, he's just like a direct path.
And he's going to get more and more to that. In fact, he just starts to do an interesting progression here, and he ends up with David. Let's look at a place where it's a lot clearer. We get Ram, and he becomes the father of Aminadab. He becomes the father of Shan. Shan becomes the father of Nahshon is the grandfather. So Nahshon becomes the father of Salma becomes the father of Boaz. And Boaz is the one who marries Ruth, and Boaz produces Jesse, the father of David. I want you to turn to Ruth chapter 4, verse 18 to 22, and it's going to give us the same chronology in a condensed version. Ruth is going to marry Boaz when Boaz is 80 years old, and they ultimately produce Jesse.
Okay. Now these are the generations of Perez fathered Hezron, Hezron fathered Ram, and Ram fathered Aminadab, and Aminadab fathered Nahshon, and Nahshon fathered Salmon, and Salmon fathered Boaz, and Boaz fathered Obed, and Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David.
All right, so Boaz is the great-grandfather.
Great-grandfather.
Yeah, because there's a generation between
Obed, Jesse, David.
Yeah. But see, those verses, because the agenda is to cram the chronology of King David. So we see these same names in the same order, but condensed to get to David through Boaz and through Ruth. Although in First Chronicles, even though it's mentioning women like Tamar, Ruth is not mentioned.
That is interesting.
Yep. So we have these names. In verse 12, we see these familiar names of Boaz. And you can go into the little side notes and start looking at the history of these cross references like Ruth. Boaz becomes the father of Obed. Obed becomes the father of Jesse. Jesse becomes the father of Eliab, his firstborn. And then Abinadab the second, Shimea the third, Nathaniel the fourth, Radai the fifth, Ozem the sixth, David the seventh. Okay? Turn to 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 11 through 13.
Then Samuel said to Jesse, "Are these all the boys?" And he said, "The youngest is still left, but behold, he's tending the sheep." So Samuel said to Jesse, "Send word and bring him, for we will not take our places at the table until he comes here." So he sent word and brought him in. Now he was reddish, with beautiful eyes and a handsome appearance. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward.
And he is anointed king of Israel at that point. Even though Saul was still king, he was anointed to be the future king. Here we have the story of the seventh kid.
Yeah, the youngest.
David. Jesse didn't even bring him out when the prophet Samuel came to visit and said, "One of your sons has been chosen by God." Jesse didn't even think to bring David.
Yeah, it can't be him. He's the youngest.
He's just a snot-nosed kid, and he's out tending the sheep. And it describes him as he's very handsome, but he's got a lot of tan. He's ruddy. So he's very tanned because he's out taking care of the sheep.
He got the chore that no one else wanted to do.
That's right. So at this point, we've finished the line of Israel 700 years later to David. But here's where we find something very interesting in the last couple of verses we're going to look at today.
Okay.
Let's go to that. I want you to notice now it says David was the seventh, right?
Yep.
And their sisters were Zariah and Abigail. Now, whose sisters?
Jesse's sons, Jesse's
Okay.
daughters.
Now, what we find out is that Jesse married a widow. So these sisters end up being half sisters of David.
Okay.
But they're in the family. There's no question that they're in the family, but they're half sisters. Now that becomes important because they're mentioned here. They're not in the line of Messiah, but they're in David's family. And something interesting, you ask yourself the question, all of a sudden, now we've achieved the lineage to David, the producer of the Messiah. So why go into the sisters? And there's a section here that goes into the sisters and the children of Hezron is going to be coming up in the next few verses, all the way down to the end of chapter 2.
Okay.
Because we don't get into David's line until chapter 3. So here is why it's in the scriptures. And that is this next verse. Now, you've got Zariah and Abigail, and the three sons of Zariah were Abishai, Joab, and Ashiel. Do you notice Joab there? This is where I learned something I had never seen before. Who is Joab?
Isn't he part of David's military force?
Exactly right. When David becomes an outlaw and starts to assemble this little army of misfits, the guy who leads that is Joab. Now, what that means, and this is, I never put this together before, Joab is David's nephew.
Okay.
And I never had seen that. Now, cousins become important, and Hezron is, we're going to see that now. There's going to be a record of some cousins that are involved. And these cousins support King David in his time as an outlaw and even as a king.
Okay, yeah.
They're not in the line of Messiah, but they're in the line that supports the king who produces Messiah.
Just like Joab does.
Just like Joab does. Let's go to 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 24.
But Joab and Abishai pursued Abner, and when the sun was going down, they came to the hill of Ammah, opposite Giah by the wilderness of Gibeon.
All right, now that's important. Let me go back here real quick. Abigail bore Amasa, and the father of Amasa was Jether. Now, if you go into these sons, you go, the sons of Zariah were Abishai, Joab, and Asiel, right? Now, if you go into 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 22 to 31, Abner kills the youngest son of Zariah, who is a half-brother. He is the son of Jesse. And you go, wait a minute now. So I've got that by researching Asiel, killed by Abner. Who's Abner? If you go back into the research of who Abner is, Abner was a Benjamite. He is the son of Benjamin. At one point, Benjamin was at war with Judah. The three sons take off to fight with Abner, and Asiel is the youngest and fastest. He goes way ahead, and he gets there, and Abner kills him. He is killed by a fellow Jew, a son of Abraham.
Yeah.
It's up to Joab and the other son to avenge the killing of their brother by this other Jew. It's very interesting that the line here is threatened by this war within the 12 tribes of Israel.
And isn't it because Saul's in the Benjamin tribe and David is in Judah, and so they become at war?
Yeah, a lot of the nations warred with each other.
Okay.
Over land and over dominance, over who was going to lead the 12 tribes. There was a covenant that if one tribe got in trouble, the other tribes would come and fight for them. That started to be, I'm sick and tired of going over and fighting for the kids of Jesse. I want to go off on my own, or I'll protect my own lands. So there was friction. But the point of this is that Joab was a military guy when he was a kid who was sent to avenge his brother's killing by Abner. You can research that in other places, especially in 2 Samuel chapter 2. Now, I want to go back to Joab and look at one last detail. Then we get Joab mentioned. They come up and basically agree to a truce. But it shows that Joab is a fighting man early in his life.
He's still young at that point.
And still young at that point. Now, if we jump ahead to 2 Samuel chapter 8, verse 16.
Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was commander over the army, and Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was secretary.
So what we see is Joab, David's cousin, becomes the general of his army.
Yeah.
And later we see a number of times where Joab advises King David. He comes as a military leader. It's like his defense secretary. He comes and advises David a number of times. And look, I've been reading the scriptures and I knew who Joab was. When I was reading in First Chronicles, Joab jumped out and I went, wait a minute, I didn't know he was related to David. So he's David's nephew.
Cool.
I wanted to go through these 17 verses because it's weird. We get to King David in 17 verses, but there's another 38 verses that talk about relatives of David before we get to the line of David.
So there has to be some significance.
So we're going to finish up chapter 2 next week and see where some of these cousins, some of these relatives start to support what is happening to the Davidic line and ultimately the line of Messiah. Interesting thing. It's not only the line of the priests for the temple worship, but also the line of David, which is going to produce Messiah, but also interested in secondary people that support David in his succession as king and ultimately the producer of the line of Messiah, who's going to be sitting on the throne of King David forever. We'll pick this up next week from verse 18 on to the end. How often is Hezron mentioned? Today we've been looking at David's family and hopefully learning some interesting things. I want to recommend a video to you. It's called David, Jesus, You and Me. It's out of Psalm 132, and I think you'll enjoy it. We're going to continue in our study of First Chronicles next week. And until then, God bless you.